Am I naive? Maybe I am too hopeful. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe I'm stupid. I am blonde after all, right? Just a blonde, stupid, right-wing dum-dum. I guess I just continue to have hope for a field that I dreamed about being part of since I was in the sixth grade. I mean, you know, the job of a free press, it's so critical to our democracy. I mean, we started, I think it was last week, we started the week with a half hour about just the clear decline of the free press, of the fourth estate, of the media, the clear and present bias, the undeniable bias against conservatives. And I guess I always hope that at some point they're going to find their way back to what the core responsibility they have to the American people is, and that's holding powerful people accountable. But then, you look at, I think there's a lot of similarities right now between how the media at large nationally is treating Kamala Harris and how the local media in Washington state is treating Attorney General Bob Ferguson during his race for the governor's office. There's a clear, and it's all kind of fruit of the same poisonous, sick, dying tree, and that's bias, right? You have Kamala Harris, who's out on the campaign trail all of a sudden claiming to support policies that she's never supported before, and not only has she not supported them before, she's supported policies that are the antithesis of those policies. She's running ads claiming to be, a champion at the border when they're distancing her from the phrase border czar and all of these things. So you have that going on, and the media really not interested in calling her out on real discrepancies between Vice President Kamala Harris and current candidate for President Kamala Harris. And then the same here with Bob Ferguson. And I get it, we're in a blue state, but I don't know how many times I have to say it. That should mean that the party that gets the harshest, most critical treatment from the media here ought to be Democrats, because they're the ones with power and control, and they're the ones that are making decisions that are impacting people's lives. Yet here you have Bob Ferguson, similar to Kamala Harris, pretending to be a completely different human being on the campaign trail for governor than he's been for the last 12 years as Attorney General. And for some ungodly reason, the media doesn't see fit to call him on it, to question him about it. I think it was about a month ago on this show, I released 15 questions. I did an article on our subscription platforms, and the headline was 15 questions Bob Ferguson should answer before Election Day. I said, we can only hope the news media will do enough to vet those who seek the highest office in our state. And the questions were very straightforward, because Bob Ferguson's campaign said it won't respond to our requests for comment anymore. Fine. That's their prerogative. I'm supporting Dave Reichert. I'm very critical of Bob Ferguson. If that's what they choose to do, fine. But my questions were very simple, yet they haven't been asked by the media. How is it that he's pretending all of a sudden to be a law and order candidate who is supportive of law enforcement when he didn't stand up for law enforcement in 2020, when crime has increased under his watch as the state's chief law enforcer, etc. Things like, why didn't he say anything during the summer of 2020 in the riots around Chaz and Chop? Why did he only launch a retail theft task force 2 years after retail theft became a prominent issue? There are so many. It was just a list of 15 simple questions. Please, for the love of God, will someone in the media who his campaign will respond to send him at least a couple of those questions to try to vet this guy who is very possibly going to be the next governor of Washington state. So I did that. And then all of a sudden there have been, three scandals back to back to back involving Bob Ferguson that, again, as I've said previously, they would tank any other campaign involving a Republican. If a Republican governor, a candidate for governor, had any one of those three scandals, their campaign would be over. It would be dust. But for some reason, not only has Bob Ferguson weathered these scandals, but he's managed to weather them really because the media at large has failed to pick them up and has failed to hold him accountable. And again, I'm not expecting the media to take a position on Bob Ferguson. No, just do the basic tenets of your job. Just ask him the questions. Just ask him the freaking questions. So I have to add, can I add addendums, Nicole, to my list of 15 questions for Bob Ferguson? I mean, the media hasn't asked him the 15, but I gotta add today questions 16, 17, and 18, because they involve these three scandals that he has been allowed to get off scot-free for. Like, what is happening? I don't understand what's happening. And I mean, I do, but I still, it's shocking. It's a shocking dereliction of duty for the mainstream media. So here it is. I'm just going to keep adding them. Question 16 for Bob Ferguson. If there's anyone who actually cares about being a journalist, who wants to propose a question that even moderately resembles this one, please do. So here it is. So question 16. Over the past 8 months, Democrats in Washington state have encouraged and shared hotlines to harass lawful signature gatherers, sued to keep 2 presidential candidates off the ballot, and sued to stop initiatives from going to voters. Do you consider those things to be attacks on our democracy? And that is, of course, tied to the scandal that I had already included in my first 15 questions, was, do you regret asking Secretary of State Steve Hobbs to violate election law? A scandal that only a few in the media even covered and really did not hold him to account for. So I think it is perfectly reasonable for the media that talks about, threats to democracy from the right in a blue state to look at a long list of clear efforts to undermine our democratic process that Bob Ferguson himself has been involved in, and to demand to know, do you see those things as attacks on or efforts to undermine our democracy? Is that a biased question? Is that an unfair question? I don't think so. You let me know. Let's move on to question 17, the second scandal he has seemingly just been able to weather because the media just does not care about it. You have listed multiple people and entities that your office informed of a lawsuit against Let's Go Washington initiatives. Yet you did not inform Let's Go Washington or the initiative sponsor, Jim Walsh, of the lawsuit directly. Why? Bob Ferguson was on the defensive last week, putting out all these posts on X saying, well, I let some lawyers know about it at a convention. We briefed certain members of legislative staff about it. Hell, we the dockets for the case are public record. But you'll notice nowhere in that word vomit soup of efforts to explain all the people he did tell did he say that he had told Let's Go Washington or Jim Walsh. Why did he not tell them? Is that a biased question? Is that an unfair question? Is this an issue that should be completely ignored by the media? I don't think so. And finally, my third addendum, question 18, to questions the media needs to ask Bob Ferguson, please God, before the election comes. During your campaign, you have bragged repeatedly about protecting communities from sexually violent predators. Yet, according to the Seattle Times, releases of SVPs off McNeil Island have accelerated during your time as Attorney General. How do you explain the inconsistency between your campaign claims and the data? That is absolutely a question he should be asked by every major media outlet in town. And you might say of that one, well, that's based on Seattle Times reporting, Brandi. So the Seattle Times did this report. We talked about it at length on the show yesterday. The Seattle Times did do a report. The headline, Walk and Find Hundreds for Sexual Violence. Then it quietly began releasing them. And yeah, they did a great report digging into data showing 1 in 4 people quietly released off McNeil Island while Bob Ferguson says he's protecting your communities from them, that they went out and committed new law violations. The state doesn't even track their behavior. 1 in 7 committed new serious violent law violations. Meanwhile, Bob Ferguson's on the campaign trail like, hey, I'm protecting your communities from sexually violent predators. So yeah, the Times did the story, but as I noted on the show yesterday, the one thing they didn't mention in the entire story is Bob Ferguson. The one thing they didn't mention in the entire story is that the guy who for the last 12 years has been Attorney General, the office tasked with keeping violent predators on McNeil Island if they pose a threat to the community, that guy in the last few weeks has been bragging that he's doing just that, while our own reporting shows he hasn't. So they did the story, but they didn't do anything in the story to ask Bob Ferguson about his recent claims on the campaign trail, to make him square his claims with the truth and the data that they uncovered. So again, they're just letting him off the hook. So we now have 3 scandals that would have sunk a Republican candidate's for governor's campaign. We have the attacks on democracy from Democrats, including Bob Ferguson himself, who publicly demanded that the Secretary of State break election law. That is not coming from me or a Republican or Dave Reichert. That's coming from Steve Hobbs, the Democratic Secretary of State, who was shocked that Bob Ferguson would ask him to do that. So that's scandal 1, that he weathered without a problem. Scandal 2, He didn't want to be seen as defending the big bad initiatives before the primary election because those initiatives aren't popular with the far left voters that he needed. And so he kept it secret from Let's Go Washington. He kept it secret from Jim Walsh, the sponsor of those initiatives. And the media has not seen fit to ask him why. And if they're not willing to ask that, the media has not seen fit to ask him why he thinks it's appropriate to defend a lawsuit that is brought about by one of his major campaign donors against initiatives that he doesn't support personally. So there were a lot of avenues the media could have gone to ask a question about that scandal. But nope, let's just ignore it. And then again, we bring it to the third scandal, which I think is the most nefarious of them all, because it's sick and twisted to pretend on the campaign trail that you're protecting these communities from rapists and from pedophiles when in reality, your office is doing the exact opposite. They're letting them go at an alarming rate. There's more of these sexually violent predators that have been released now under Bob Ferguson than remain on McNeil Island in the first place. And they don't even track them to see about, the guy who got off McNeil Island, went to Maryland and attacked a 74-year-old woman while she was sleeping in her bed. And he has the audacity to lie. And then go back a year and a half ago, as we opened the show yesterday, and you look at the communities that have been raising holy hell for the last year and a half about these sexually violent predators being placed in their backyards. And no one, including Bob Ferguson, gave them the freaking time of day. But now that he wants to be governor, he's like, I care about protecting you from pedophiles and rapists. No, you freaking don't. You don't. And it kills me that the Seattle Times went 90% of the way there, did all this work. They started this story a year ago, did all this work, but didn't do the last 10%, the most important 10% of that job, and say, hey, Bob Ferguson, why are you lying to people about this? Drives me nuts. So there you have it. I'll officially add those to the list. Now we've got 18 questions. For the love of God, will the mainstream media please ask Bob Ferguson before the election in November? And I'm sure there's 100 questions about 100 things he's lied about that we could add to that list. I want to continue, though, with our coverage of this sex offender issue because it's grotesque. It's horrifying. So again, we talked about the Seattle Times coverage yesterday. The fact they didn't call Bob Ferguson out for it. But, yesterday on the show, we spoke with Sarah Fox, who is one of the Tenino parents that successfully fought back against a less restrictive facility that would have housed these sexually violent predators in the future. They were able to stop it. No thanks to Governor Inslee. No thanks to Bob Ferguson. But one of the advocates and the champions that they did have in their corner was State Representative Travis Couture, a Republican from Allen. He and State Representative Dan Griffey, also a Republican, they fought side by side with these parents. And then they tried to take those parents' concerns and turn them into legislation in Olympia and got a lot of pushback from Democrats. And so the question certainly for Representative Travis Couture, he's going to join us on the show today, is, do you think that at least the Seattle Times reporting opens the door to Democrats being willing to fix some of these issues? So I do want to give you a warning before we go into this pre-taped interview with Representative Couture. Some of what we talk about is graphic. I made a similar warning on the show yesterday. When you're talking about sexually violent predators and some of the horrific crimes they've committed, I think it's important to detail it. It's important to say it. It's important to know just how sick and twisted and dangerous and horrible these people that are on that island are. These people who Bob Ferguson's office are saying, oh yeah, let them go. So I do want to give you that warning. If that's just not something that you're up to listening to today, you might want to tune out for the length of Representative Travis Couture's conversation with us. Here it is. Representative Couture, welcome back to Undivided.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. Is this vindication for you, or is it just make you angrier?
It's vindication, and also vindication for my constituents, just because we were gaslit every step of the way saying that no one reoffends, nothing bad ever happens, but Seattle Times put together the data and we were right. And so we told you so.
Yeah. Did you know the Times was working on this?
Yeah, actually, they interviewed myself and my seatmate, Representative Dan Griffey, over a year ago for part 2. So they've been working on it for quite a while, so long that I frankly forgot they were doing it.
So they were interviewing you over a year ago, kind of when we were in the midst of some of these battles, right?
Yeah, it was after session, but Some of the battles had already kind of gone on by that time.
Yeah. I mean, better late than never. Like, we'll take it, right? But you mentioned, vindication on behalf of your constituents. We had one of them on yesterday who, one of the Tenino parents, Sarah Fox, who'd been instrumental in defeating the placement of an LRA in their community. I mean, what would you say to your constituents who, like you said, they've been gaslit basically to think that their concerns were nothing concerns. Nobody wanted to help them besides you and a couple other people like Dan Griffey. They got pushed back the entire way. I mean, what would you say to them today?
Um, So my constituents have been essentially terrorized by this. And then even though we won twice, and even just close to Tenino in Rochester, they tried it again, but we stopped it so soon that it really didn't hit the news that hard. But the threat of it coming back still is ever present in their minds, and of course we've been pushing bipartisan legislation. And I guess what I would say is that changing the law takes time, and to do it right takes time. And this is a very complicated system. We've done the right things to put the right bills together, and just never give up. Just never give up. We got to keep fighting to make the changes to make sure that we ensure public safety for people in our communities.
Yeah, so let's talk about what happens from here. Because I have a fear, and tell me if my fear is completely off base, okay? The Seattle Times stories seem to really focus in on, like, maybe McNeil Island doesn't even work. Maybe the treatment there doesn't even work because 1 in 4 commit new crimes, 1 in 7 commit new violent crimes. It's very, very expensive. Could you see this as sort of bolstering the argument that McNeil Island shouldn't even exist for sexually violent predators?
Well, I think that's what you see in the data is that, you have this stunning rise in releases, frankly, over the term of our current Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, but then also a severe lack of admissions. And so, really, when you look through the data, it looks like they're trying to empty out McNeil Island into our communities. But McNeil Island and this system has existed since the 1990s, and it was working just fine until more recently, when they tried to stick more of these sexually violent predators into our communities. So I know things are a little bit more expensive, but some of that is the time, some of that is this inflationary period, and some of state policies and spending. But I mean, how do you put a price tag on public safety with people who have raped continuously children? And it's just a weird idea that they want to put those people into our communities and somehow normalize that. Their recidivism rate is 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 7, violently so. Uh, we don't want to roll the dice in our community with people like that.
Yeah, and you've been I mean, you're like scorched earth on social media. I don't blame you, man. This is like, like you said, vindication, but you've been pointing out some of the really dangerous people who have gotten off McNeil Island, and what they've done. Can you give us some examples? It doesn't have to be names, but
Yeah, I mean, anyone, Brandi, who can continuously rape an infant or a 5-year-old or 8-year-olds or 13-year-olds, giving them sexually transmitted diseases like gonorrhea, tying them up with wire to a tree. The original case that started this whole system in the 90s in McNeil Island is so horrific. Everyone knew that once the original person was to get out of prison, that they would commit horrible crimes, but there was no system in place to stop them. And that's exactly what they did. Lured a little boy into the woods, cut off his genitals, and he still lived. And that was after sexually assaulting and raping him almost to death. I mean, I know it's disgusting and it's disturbing, but we have to realize these people will not reform, and they do not belong in our communities unconditionally, number one, but they have to, of course, they're civilly committed, so they have to have a pathway to try. But as the Seattle Times pointed out, many of them aren't even taking on the treatment. They don't want to admit guilt.
now that the Seattle Times has put this data out there, has proven that these parents' concerns in these communities were 100% valid. I mean, we all knew that, right? I guess we need data to show us that it's valid to be concerned about a sexually violent predator in your neighborhood near a bus stop. But does this help you on your mission to try to make the laws around this better? Will more Democrats listen now that the Times has done something?
I hope so. We had good bipartisan bills. They were well worked. We worked with DSHS on a lot of them to try to clean up this system to improve public safety. We've had multiple bills, including public notice. The governor vetoed it. Well, there'll be a new governor in town, one way or another. And so I'm hoping that this is the straw that breaks the camel's back to end the argument, because it's not the legislation that's the problem. It's the paradigm in Olympia with some of the radical left progressives that want to protect criminals and pedophiles instead of innocent people in our streets or in our communities, and especially people who have been victimized by sexual assault or rape that exist in our communities and don't want to be terrorized and victimized once again by having sexually violent predators live next door to them with no security.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned, I don't think that's hyperbole to say they want to protect criminals and pedophiles. Just this past legislative session, the chair of what amounts to the Public Safety Committee in the House was pushing a bill that would end this, mandatory lifetime community custody. And it's like, why? Why is that the public safety bill that you're focused on helping pedophiles and sex offenders? It's very strange. Do you think that bill gets resurrected or no?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess we'll see. But I mean, I even had a bill that would close a loophole for supervision credits for SVPs that are in the LRAs.
Yep.
And Representative Simmons turned around the next day after the hearing and dropped a competing bill to end supervision for SVPs. I mean, that's obviously the opposite direction when you're looking at a 1 in 4 reoffense. Uh, we had bills to add, we had an amendment to a state ID card bill to add a sexually violent predator designation to the state ID card, because now every sexually violent predator has a state ID card. And it's helpful for people who are civilly committed to enter their appointments and their medical appointments and everything else. But we wanted to make sure that if they escape or abscond, that they wouldn't have a easier ability to get on a bus or go to a restaurant and people don't know who they are. I mean, even Keith DeVos, the leader at the Special Commitment Center, even said, "Hey, these people could be at a restaurant next to me and my kids,
Yeah.
and that makes me uncomfortable." You
Yeah.
know?
I want to end with this because you mentioned, one way or the other, we're going to have a new governor this coming legislative session. But there's a big difference between the two people who that could be. And I'm not asking you to take a political position on it. But this Seattle Times article, for as grateful as I am that they did the digging and got the data, not one mention of Bob Ferguson. Not one mention of the man who's the attorney general, the office tasked with trying to keep these predators on that island. Someone who has been campaigning in recent weeks by saying he is protecting communities from violent predators. What do you make of the fact that the Times did all this work but didn't mention his name once?
Yeah, the first thought I have is, well, obviously that's typical. As a conservative, that's how I feel like I've been abused by the Seattle Times my entire life. But at the same time, I think that there's a lot of people, even some people who endorse Bob Ferguson, who are afraid of him, who are afraid of how vindictive and petty he is. And I think the media, in turn, also fears losing access with Democrats and with Bob Ferguson. And I think they feared that with Jay Inslee as well, but more so with Bob because of the way he acts over the last 12 years as Attorney General. And it is his job to keep us safe, to defend the people in court, to make sure that sexually violent predators who should not be released remain on McNeil Island.
Yeah.
And he's either A, failed to do that miserably, or B, has failed on purpose. And whichever one you pick, it's the numbers, even though they didn't mention him, the numbers really show how much he's failed in that arena.
Yeah, it can't be both ways. You can't be bragging in your election for governor that you're protecting communities from sexually violent predators and then have the data that shows the exact opposite. I mean, obviously, I trust what the Seattle Times has put out more than I trust Bob Ferguson at this point. But, well, Travis Couture, I mean, you know, you stuck with those parents and your constituents longer than anybody, you and Rep. Dan Griffey, and you believed them when a lot of powers that be didn't take them seriously and didn't take their concerns seriously. So, you know, you're owed a debt of gratitude, I think, for actually doing what a public servant is supposed to do. And we'll see if this changes the landscape of this debate.
Yep, it's their voice. I'm just their bullhorn to make sure it's heard.
So we appreciate Representative Travis Couture, again, his diligent commitment to his constituents on this issue. And I know he's going to try, again, like hell, this legislative session to get people to understand that these people were put on an island for a reason. And look, I believe in constitutional rights. I do believe you have to have a path off lifetime civil commitment because these are individuals who are, remember, they already served their prison sentence. Then they're civilly committed because they were deemed irredeemable. You have to have a path if you can be redeemed, you know, medically speaking, off the island. This is the United States of America. And that might be unpopular, but that's the reality. And if you're going to just give the government carte blanche to lock someone on an island and throw away the key, that same government is going to take away a lot of your other constitutional rights and freedoms, etc. But when you have an Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, who is bragging on the campaign trail that he protects these communities from these sexually violent predators when he knows damn well the rate at which they're being released from McNeil Island, it's so insanely dishonest. It's so insanely disappointing that the media just says, not a big deal. We're not going to cover that. And it leaves the rest of us with common sense and a brain wondering, what do we do? What do we do if they can lie and get away with it and twist the truth? And when we complain, they treat us like we're crazy and that there's not really a safety concern or a risk. And then the media, it doesn't have our back. What do you do? I mean, I can only imagine. At least I have a show where I can come on and I can vent about all this stuff and talk about how stupid it is and how dangerous it is and how awful it is. I feel bad for you guys. Where are you venting? I guess on social media. But it's insanely frustrating. And again, I would just... oh my gosh, I would beg my friends in the media, my former colleagues in the media, really sit and think for a second about these 3 scandals that we've detailed on this show. And look, again, I have my opinion. I don't like Bob Ferguson. I don't want him to be the next governor. I think he's a very dangerous man. But you can look at these through a nonpartisan, unbiased lens and realize that in any universe, this is a legitimate news story and things that the voters deserve to have answers to. So I'm sorry, but do your damn jobs. I have yet to go scorched earth on the local media. I've been very critical. I don't think you want to see what my scorched earth looks like. So I'll just keep that in my back pocket for now. But this has been incredibly, incredibly disappointing. I would say I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. But I am both mad and disappointed.